Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Drug Information Association, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar titled, When Outsourcing Stops Making Sense, being held in conjunction with DIA-Cytel. After today's webinar is complete, you will be immediately directed to a page to complete our online survey. DIA is committed to developing quality education programs that meet the needs of its members, and your feedback is greatly appreciated. The results of these online surveys are used to plan future programs. Questions and answers will be taken after today's presentations, but please feel free to submit your questions at any time by using the question and answer box in the lower right-hand corner of the WebEx screen. The moderator for today's webinar is Mike Weitz, Director of Marketing at DIA-Cytel. And before I turn over the webinar to Mr. Weitz, I just wanted to make a quick note that Steve Herbert, who is presenting today, has disclosed to us that he is an employee of DIA-Cytel and other than that has no financial relationships. At this time, I will turn it over to Mr. Weitz and enjoy today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Ben, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning on the East Coast. This is Mike Weitz from DIA-Cytel in Cambridge. I'm together here with Steve Herbert, who is our lead presenter. We're joined today by a discussant, Darren Abrams, and I'm going to hand it right over to Steve so we can get started. Steve?
Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks for the introduction, Ben, and welcome, Darren. I appreciate the invitation to present this talk today. I'm Steve Herbert. I'm a biologist and a business person by training. A little background on me. I've created or been part of the executive team for 5 life sciences technology startups in the last 20 years. One of these companies is now a prospering public company, Outsourcing, and 3 have been acquired by public entities, including Cardinal Health Systems, the most recent company I was connected with called Wavemark. The current venture, DIA-Cytel, remains a successful and independent small business and the source of much of the material for today's presentation. I come, just like DIA-Cytel, from a software and algorithm background, and we decided to enter the clinical research services business in 2005, and did so with an initial contract with Wyeth. I'll talk a little more about that. At that time, together with Jerry Schindler, who's now with Merck, running their late-stage statistics group. By 2008, it was obvious we needed professional help. And so we gradually hired and put together a world-class services business, expanding over time to become what is now 2/3 of our business. Still, by every measure, DIA-Cytel is a very small specialty CRO, known in part through our founders' breakthrough work in computing exact statistics, also in part for designing and running adaptive clinical trials, and last but not least, for this presentation at least, its significant offshore team in India in 3 locations, Pune, Bangalore, and Hyderabad. Prior to this morning's talk, I received a really helpful list of questions and expectations that each of you gave to DIA when you registered, and I'm covering the majority of them just to give you a sense. People have been asking, are there certain activities that should or should not be outsourced? I will cover that. They've also asked about quality and timeline issues, saying that a number of you have experienced major quality and timeline issues outsourcing, and I will speak to that also. And others, several, have asked questions concerning gaining knowledge about the current environment in the industry with regards to outsourcing, the trends, and a different perspective, and I think you will get that from my presentation today. Other questions are concerning roles, like the role of the company statistician for a project that's outsourced, and then looking at tipping points. So anyway, I'll move into the presentation really shortly, and I believe many of those learning points and questions will be addressed, and some will come up during the presentation. CyTel, just a little background, CyTel provides a mix of both offshore outsourcing and traditional domestic CRO biostats, contract research biostats and data management service, in addition to the software which does the design and simulation of clinical trials. I've been with CyTel 10 years. So today I'm going to guide you through the trends that are playing out in the global outsourcing business that you're not necessarily thinking about every day. I'll refer to my experience in CyTel, and I'll use 3 specific examples, including a fuller case study, which is the Merck Serono, which we'll talk about towards the last third of my presentation this morning. Each of these will shed some light on the successes and failures in offshoring and some of the reasons for unexpected disappointments. And although I'm primarily looking at global outsourcing, all but the final case study actually use a mixed model of onshore and offshore resources. So this is the disclaimer that they're my opinions and should not be attributed to DIA. Either now or at the end of the presentation, you can get a copy of my slides and follow along at www.cytel.com. And this URL will be also at the end of my presentation for those of you that want to copy it down after I've finished. What you will learn in the presentation is what I will cover is four main items. And at the conclusion of the talk, my intention is you'll be more informed about the risks and the benefits of global outsourcing and the operational and procurement considerations that may be different to sourcing via a domestic CRO. So if you're sitting comfortably, then I'll begin. Here are the 4 main points I'll be covering. Number 1, outsourcing is with us and with us to stay because of the benefits that it offers: cost savings, labor flexibility, and access to specialized skills. I'll be going into each of these points in a lot more detail. Number 2, that offshore outsourcing for cost alone, for cost savings alone, is risky because the short-run benefits may be reversed quicker than it takes to realize the true gains. I'll spend some time speaking about those risks. Third, that simple return on investment calculations and auction-style bidding, which of course I've been a part of, and frequently procurement departments want those ROI calculations, managers and so forth want to see that. They often accompany the drive to reduce costs, and that is often the drive for particularly global outsourcing, but I'll be arguing that they do not provide an adequate picture nor a good way to choose an outsourced clinical partner, and you'll hear in considerable detail some of the pitfalls, possibilities there. And last but not least, that global outsourcing does work in many situations. Several of these I'm going to indicate. So the first, well, first of all, by way of background into my perspective on the whole outsourcing phenomenon, at the end of the day, I think that we in the biopharma industry are wasting untold billions on pointless reports, tables, figures, listings, and filings, which we outsource. So that's simply a point of view. I've never been a big advocate of reports that no one ever reads, unless you have a disaster and a swarm of lawyers that get their teeth into them. So with that background, that's my perspective on it. And you will understand with that why a number of things that perplex me about clinical outsourcing, and we'll talk a little about that. But I'm going to ask, how do we start making sense of all this? And starting at the top, The biggest driver is that outsourcing is big business, and it's not a trend that's likely to be reversed or reversed quickly. According to the Gartner Group, it's going to account for $288 billion worldwide this year. At the moment, India is the greatest recipient of services outsourcing, and China the largest manufacturing beneficiary. Of that $288 billion, most is IT outsourcing. $50 billion of that $288, though, is spent by the biopharmaceutical industry. And of course, that's all I'll cover. And I'll deal with the CRO piece of that, which is about $20 billion of the $50 billion. And I will not talk about the contract manufacturing, which is about $30 billion, which is outsourcing of active pharmaceutical ingredients. So why is outsourcing big business? What's driving it? Well, it's complicated. It's not one thing. But let's ask that question in the context of big pharma. What's driving outsourcing? Is it the attraction of flexible labor contracts versus fixed overhead employee relationships? Labor that can be turned on and off like the flow of water from your faucet. Those are pretty nice business benefits. Having someone else whose job it is to manage the risk of workflow fluctuations is efficient, to say the least. Or maybe what's driving outsourcing is the lure of offshore labor rates at 1/5 of the US or Western Europe. It has to be those costs, right? Well, maybe. Maybe procurement thinks so. Maybe in the mad dash for quarterly profits, your CEO thinks so too. But no. In the end, the big driving trend is not cost. That is simply a consequence. So take a look at this slide and let me take a moment to explain it. What this slide shows is that in 2012, 7 of the top 10 pharmaceutical companies lost $31.2 billion of sales, prescription drug sales. And 3 of the top 3, that's all of the top 3, Pfizer, Novartis, and Merck, between them, lost about nearly $20 billion, was wiped off the slate from those companies. The problem is the top line. The consequence is the bottom line. The problem is revenue. The consequence is cost. The problem is revenues and innovation. The consequence of that is an urgent need to control costs, just to stay in the game. So why does that all matter? Because if you're not already one of these companies, there will come a time for you when cost really matters, if it doesn't already. And there'll come a time when someone asks you, probably your boss, your VC, or your board, why not do this in China, Steve, or India, or someplace cheaper? Outsourcing is clearly a key for some companies in some situations to being able to stay in the game long enough to replace those sales. However, for most companies, fortunately, it is simply a part of a bundle of tactics to improve focus, R&D productivity, and profitability. Either way, it's immensely seductive. And as I've said, offshore outsourcing is a fact of life because of the cost savings, labor flexibility, and access to specialized skills. So if the benefits are so great, and they can be, and if so many billions are spent on outsourcing, why are there so few quantitative studies about quality and cost? Why did so many of you ask questions about when to do that, how much is it going to cost, what are the benefits, why you're having so many quality problems running with your outsourcing partner? Why is it we can say so little quantitatively about the actual benefits experienced by sponsor companies, the broad, long-term ones like the benefits to medicine and the social costs of shifting employment patterns, which consume our politicians, and the shorter-run cost efficiency equations, which maybe you are more looking at day to day, which tend to drive procurement decisions and partnerships? So I don't know the answer to that one, but maybe there's another opportunity for a data-driven consulting company to gather and analyze the data. By the way, there are plenty of studies sizing the outsourcing markets in the CRO business, but very few talking about quality and the experience of sponsor companies. However, there is one group in this next slide called Avoca, who run a consortium. It's an independent consortium serving biopharma and CRO sponsors focused on quality in outsourcing. So very interesting group, as far as I can tell, really well run. This slide shows the top 5 reasons sponsors gave Avoca for entering outsourcing relationships, and naturally enough, reduction of cost is number 1. So reduce cost, improve quality, improved efficiency in the use of internal staff. Those are the top 3 reasons people are giving for outsourcing, and particularly for global or offshore outsourcing. Also, and I'll speak more about these 2, access to operational expertise and process improvement. So cost is the number 1 benefit people are looking for. And 3 years later, those same sponsors were complaining about quality, the same complaints a number of you have lodged when you registered for this talk. 3 years later, the sponsors were complaining about quality.
Steve, it's Darren here. Could I ask you to pause just momentarily and maybe shed a little bit of insight into where that shortfall might be coming from, and why? What is your insight into why they're getting worse quality post-experience than they would in-house? Where is it picking down?
Thanks for that question, Darren. I think one of the reasons is precisely, if we go back 1 slide, is precisely in the order of priorities people are outsourcing. My thesis here, and we'll speak a lot more about it, is that to outsource primarily to reduce costs is inevitably going to have consequences on quality. And one of the reasons for that is, how do you focus on cost? And the answer is that you look at your return on investment. You look at your cost, and you focus on the bottom line. So right at the beginning, the disappointments begin. Typically, calculations on cost and return on investment cannot adequately reflect the reality of the startup costs, crossing the experience chasm, the managerial overhead, the true overhead of running these contracts, such as project management costs, or the actual relative regional product differences. I'll talk about that a lot more, Darren, during the course of this presentation, but those regional product differences can be surprisingly large. Rework, non-tangible drawbacks such as customer service, staff turnover, cultural barriers, all play into an equation which is not reflected well by a pure cost or a simple return on investment calculation.
And thanks, Steve. And you just used a term, I think you said experience chasm. And since I assume that you're primarily referring to offshore outsourcing, what is the experience chasm?
Yeah, thanks. I'll clarify. Yeah, I am referring primarily to offshore outsourcing. Interestingly enough, yesterday in preparation for this, I had a conversation with a gentleman who works for Cytel and runs one of our larger offshore contracts. He is an onshore representative for the sponsor company. And he said a very interesting thing, which helps talk about this experience chasm, and then I'll define it. He said, well, in the beginning, a lot of our folks in India ask naive questions. The naive questions simply come from inexperience. There's a 9.5-hour difference between Boston, where I'm sitting, and Pune, where our office is. So that 9.5-hour difference, the question lingers, and can linger for 2 days before it gets answered. And they're questions which onshore within a sponsor typically would take 5 minutes to answer. Simply someone doesn't have the experience. So the experience chasm is what many developing countries suffer from. Even with terrific education, government investments, and social incentives, it's incredibly difficult to reproduce the ecosystem of experience possible in a more developed economy. So specifically, you cannot teach a SAS programmer in India what their American counterpart with exactly the same years of experience will learn in meetings from their clinical counterparts or operations folks or from the more experienced biostatisticians. So you simply can't replace the biopharma infrastructure that we have, say, for instance, here on the East Coast or on the West Coast overnight in China or India. That's what I call the experience chasm, and I draw it from Crossing the Chasm, Geoffrey Moore's famous book. So it isn't always plain sailing. In 2004, Pfizer set up a Mumbai statistical programming shop, and last year I heard they closed the operation and pulled out. Pfizer isn't alone among well-funded, well-managed offshore operations that ran into trouble. So how is it possible that something with so much promise can be so difficult in practice to make work and so frequently mismanaged? So the beginning of this story starts with expectations, and the path takes us through cost savings and eventually to quality. Because buried in the benefits are the sources of failure too, you need to look at why people are doing offshore outsourcing. I think we have it backwards. I think the lower cost of labor, the regulations, labor benefits, and so forth should be something that absolutely needs to be considered, but should be at the bottom of the list. First should be access to highly specialized capabilities that maybe you don't want or you don't need to have inshore all the time. Removal of non-core activities to increase focus on core, increasing the flexibility of your workload, so being able to manage peaks and troughs. And then the other more short-run cost benefits clearly come in. They shouldn't be your primary driver. They will, in fact, as I mentioned, be a primary route to failure for a number of reasons. What we've observed is that our projects have had better success when CITEL's clients have identified those specialized skills needed to make a successful project and then focused on outsourcing the non-core activities, plus perhaps some highly prized but rarely used expert skills that you just don't want to maintain in-house. For instance, if you're designing an adaptive trial, you need someone both to do that design simulation and understand the operation of that trial. So that may be an example of an expert skill that all but the top half dozen pharmaceutical companies may want to avoid having in-house. So those the sponsor may have difficulty providing, or those that are non-core to the business. And this has allowed, in the cases that I've been familiar with, the clients to focus on their core competencies, strategic, clinical, and biostats work, standardization of the process, measurement of quality, and so on and so forth. And it allowed CITEL to provide CITEL's core competencies to the sponsor. And the side benefits, the happy accident, so to speak, will increase flexibility of workload peaks and troughs, and a whole package of consequential cost savings in the short and long term. So the cost benefits were in fact a consequence of taking the right strategic decision and not the cause. In fact, to outsource for cost benefit alone is always dangerous, but to offshore for cost benefit alone is doubly so, because the short-run benefits it provides may be reversed by economic or political challenges quicker than it takes to realize those true gains. And a few slides further forward, I'll speak very specifically about why that's the case and why some of the issues you're perhaps thinking about immediately I say that sentence may not be the ones that you should be concerned about. Added to that, the inexperience of the workforce may not, in some circumstances, as I've mentioned, be compensated by the lower cost of labor over the short haul. And the short haul, I mean 2 to 3 years. this might be surprising to many of you who have not experienced the productivity gap that can exist between US, Western Europe, and developing economies in some cases, such as India and China. Another direct consequence of this inexperience gap can be a quality gap, not necessarily, but maybe so. Unreliable work, rework, extended times to get it right, misunderstood instructions, or considerable project management overhead, such as the need to give much more detailed instructions where maybe fewer or none were needed for the in-house team. Even the best laid plans are going to go wrong when you relinquish control, however you do it. No matter how foolproof you make the instructions, no matter how simple or how well documented, something is bound to turn up that you did not plan for. The idea here is simply to plan for those things that are foreseeable. So in my first experience with providing Indian outsourced services, it was then to what was at the time Wyeth. It took us an entire 3-year contract of stumbling to iron out all the issues, from cultural, communication, and telecommunications, and from work definitions to managerial challenge. The contract wasn't renewed. We learned a lot from it. But we evidently were not alone. 22% of sponsor companies that were surveyed by Avoca reported having discontinued strategic relationships because of poor quality deliverables. And that statistic is reflected in a number of the questions and learning points you submitted when you registered for this webinar. Of course, Cytel did get much better at the offshoring gig since 2004, when that first contract was issued. Not every company is better, and surprisingly, it's some of the biggest who are having the most problems.
Steve, Darren again here. A few slides back, you explained some reasons why the ROI model often breaks down, and I think just to recap that point, it can be summarized as saying that ROI models are quantitative by nature, and they tend to ignore the many important qualitative factors that play into the relative success or failure of an outsourcing venture. Related to that, I think on the slide, with a substantial proportion of sponsor companies terminating relationships because of poor quality of deliverables, my question is, in my experience, quality in this context, can be very simply described as results minus the expectations going into the venture.
Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering if you have any insight based on your experience into, what underlies this particular quality problem, and how much of that may be due to the maybe naive or incorrect expectations on the part of the sponsor versus execution problems that lie within the outsourced partner. And I'm assuming that in your experience it's a blend, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, in the end, this is a complex business with many moving parts. I'm not going to sugarcoat it with oversimplistic conclusions, but it's a question everybody has. Sometimes in the experience, but often in the way the resources are used, is where the problems lie. For instance, in my next experience with Cytel, we actually used a mixed model of US resources in our office in Chesterbrook, Pennsylvania, and India resources from our Cytel Pune team. Even then, in some types of work, the extra time taken was not compensated for by the low cost of labor, which I mentioned before. So the issue you mentioned, Darren, about expectations is huge, and I'd say that's where the largest number of problems are created or started, and that often is because companies, and by the way, not all, I'll mention an exception to this, but companies often expect results really quickly, and sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes it simply isn't possible to get things up and running that fast. The degree of efficiency in that second experience which Cytel had in certain types of work was huge and very surprising. 8 to 10 times as many hours to do the same unit of work in India than the experienced folks in Pennsylvania. I didn't understand this, and I asked why. It was in situations where the tasks were complex, not well standardized, and required more than an ordinary degree of back and forth. For instance, safety memos. Things like the PK/PD memos tended to be very standardized, easy to write. Some clinical study reports were, we experienced much longer times for the India team. So sometimes it's education, and sometimes it's simply the degree of communication required and the frequency of communication required to get it right was very high. And at that point, it's likely to become less cost efficient to be doing it offshore with less experienced people, where there may be communication issues. There's definitely time zone issues, and there may be other cultural issues. One issue we ran into early, and we specifically train to avoid this issue now, is that in some cultures there's less desire to criticize the boss. There's less desire to contradict the client. That's what we expect in America and Western Europe. And when it doesn't happen, when something goes wrong later, and it's tracked back to the question simply wasn't asked. So we spend a lot of time, and I'll speak about this in a bit, training Cytel folks that are offshore. And there are certain ways you can do that is quite effective, and I'll mention that in a bit. But this experience where you get very big differences in efficiency has led me to ask why it's so difficult to get this offshore outsourced operation to be successful. What are the specifics?
Right, and acknowledging, Steve, that every situation is different and has its unique nuances. Are there some general things that can apply to most situations to improve the success rate?
Yeah, maybe so. That's tough. So the question is, what do we do to make it work 100%? And the answer, obviously, I told you I wasn't going to sugarcoat it. Cytel's first experience was painful for me. As the business development guy that negotiated that agreement, it's quite painful to see the agreement not delivered the way you anticipate. But by the way, the second experience that I mentioned, which was with a large East Coast pharmaceutical company, was again a 3-year contract and has now been renewed 3 times and extended substantially. So clearly, we began to get things right after our first 3 years of tripping over one another. And the next 2 slides, I'm going to show you a summary of the do's and the don'ts, what I think we learned, and maybe that's going to be helpful to help the attendees of this webinar avoid the problems and reap the benefits, avoid tripping up the same places that we did back in 2004. So in these next 2 slides, I'm going to show you a summary of the do's and the don'ts that we've talked about so far, before I move on to the larger forces driving the broader trends, which you have also asked about, and finally completing with my third example, a more detailed case study, which Merck Serono has kindly given us the permission to share with you. So let's look at the do's first of all, the positive side of this equation. Do outsource to increase your workload flexibility. That makes sense. What an outsourced provider can give you, any CRO can give you, they can absorb workload fluctuations by moving work from project to project and client to client in a way that's not always easy for a sponsor company to do, particularly if you're just responsible for one therapeutic area, one project, or you're a biotech company where you may have only one or two projects running. Secondly, do outsource to gain skills that you do not have. Cytel has been very successful receiving contracts for more complex studies. Studies which maybe the FDA in their initial review has rejected or not been comfortable with, or studies which simply will yield to a group sequential approach, which necessarily increases the operational complexity. So certain skills that you don't have or you do not want to keep in-house, whether that's biostats or more advanced skills, outsource for those. And another good example is Cytel has received contract work where there was substantial work in drug supply, for instance, and drug supply, predicting drug supply, making certain the appropriate amount gets to site and so on. Thirdly, do outsource to increase your home team's focus on work you cannot outsource. This is actually a subtle one because defining what your core competencies are is not as easy as it sounds, and that's critical. You need to be clear what work you want to outsource and what work you want to keep in-house, and that's going to vary very considerably sponsor to sponsor. We work with completely virtual companies where the team is simply an executive team and funding, and there's maybe an existing phase 2 candidate, for instance. They'll outsource everything, and there needs to be different type of agreement and obviously a great deal of trust. And we work with the biggest pharmaceutical companies too. Their definition of what is the core competency may be quite different from, a virtual biotech company. So that decision about the work you cannot outsource, the work you absolutely need to keep in-house, is one that's going to be very personal and absolutely needs to be done. And so you'll see in slides later that I do not recommend outsourcing any core competency. Fourth, and probably one of the most important do's, is set the expectations appropriately. We'll talk a lot more about this in the context of the E&D Serono, but plan the startup time realistically, expect cultural and communications issues if you're offshoring, know what they are and train them, and do transfers between your partner and the offshore staff. Fifthly, select a partner carefully with experience and reputation in your field. Not every offshore contract research organization is equal, and as I've mentioned before, sometimes a small company can offer more of what you want. Sometimes you have to go with a big company, but you need to match your partner very carefully, precisely with the experience you want, the skills you need, and where you need the workload flexibility, and with the reputation. And then set up your key performance indicators and monitor them closely. We'll be speaking about that again in detail with respect to Cytel's experience with Serono. And then expect to adjust early and often, so keep a real close look. Those are the do's. Let's look at the don'ts. Don't outsource for short-term cost savings. Don't select your partner on price alone. Don't outsource if it would result in depletion of your core competencies. Don't expect immediate gains. Now, that isn't to say that you can't outsource one project. You can offshore and you can onshore single projects. In fact, that probably represents the majority of the $20 billion CRO business that we mentioned. If you're doing that, your relationship with your CRO and the key performance indicators, the contract you have, needs to be very carefully set up. And ideally, there needs to be an extended relationship over a series of projects. Don't expect your IT provider to do your statistical programming offshore. And there's a number of companies which offer offshoring in IT. I already mentioned that the $288 billion industry, overwhelming majority is information technology offshoring. Those companies are not going to be qualified to do your biostats. They're not going to be qualified to do your clinical study reports or your safety memos. Don't do it. Don't expect your outsourcing to solve your workflow or business problems, business process problems.
Steve, I know it's the last bullet point on that list, but I would just like to emphasize, based on my own experience, that that's a really important point to take into consideration. I would share that experience. I don't think that an outsourcing relationship really ever can solve an inherent workflow or a business process problem. I have found, in addition, it oftentimes shines a light on those problems where there may be internal workarounds and sort of systems that people are used to dealing with, and they may remain a bit buried beneath the radar. But as soon as you need to be dealing with the communications issues and the workflow issues involving a third party, it's been my experience that it often uncovers some things that may have previously been not dealt with, and can sometimes, in fact, amplify those problems. And I'm wondering if you've seen the same thing.
Yeah, actually, that's true. I agree with the way you put it. If a business problem exists, you're going to outsource that business problem. Outsourcing, as you implied, Darren, does not relieve the sponsor of the responsibility for deficiencies or the responsibility of fixing them. So ideally, you're going to outsource things where the process is well understood. The act of outsourcing is simply going to outsource your problems. It's not going to solve them. And I agree, there are times when it shines a light on the problem, but equally there are times where it doesn't, and the problems continue to exist, and they're blamed on outsourcing, and that is definitely one source of disappointment and failure in some relationships. Before I continue, I'm going to look at some of the trends, but I wanted to say I've painted a really tough picture, and that was intentional, but I have to say there are numerous good experiences with globally outsourced projects that have been planned and executed well. In 2001, for instance, Novartis established a statistical reporting team in India. Michael Bull heads their oncology statistical reporting group and summarized their situation in a Fuse presentation, I think it was in February of this year, and he said, "We found there's no quick and easy way to create an integrated programming team in India. We started small, and education was key because the India team had no or limited exposure to pharmaceutical development. So staff rotations between India, Europe, and the US became key." And by the way, as I mentioned, this is something Cytel does routinely. I'll say a little bit more about that when we deal with the Serono case. Michael Bull from the Novartis Oncology Group goes on to say, investment is more valuable than cost savings, and long-term benefits, not just the budget, should be considered. So it's good to hear a sponsor talking specifically about what you need to take care of in that. So I'm going to move on to the trends and changing trends in outsourcing. So there are commercial, economic, and political issues to consider, political trends to consider, and there are several reasons to take a number of these issues seriously. One is history, the instability of global economics and the politics that go along with it. That may sound a long way away from outsourcing, but you'll see in the next slide it's really near-term issue. Secondly, outsourcing implementation startup experiences I just outlined, meaning specifically how long it takes to get an offshore operational functional. Both Michael Ball at Novartis and my experience at Cytel with our original Wires contract emphasize it just doesn't happen overnight. Once you've got the skids greased, once you have the operation running, it can be very effective, but it takes time. And thirdly, the fact that quality and thus productivity challenges are a constant companion of outsourcing means you should definitely be worrying about the short-term benefits. Grateful Dead's talented lyricist Robert Hunter, I'm going to quote, wrote some really apt lines from his song about outsourcing. Actually, it wasn't about outsourcing. It was, I think it was about JFK. But he says, History turns upon the tides and not the deeds of man. So you'll see from this list that there are some pretty big factors weighing into what's going on with outsourcing. So first, let me state what I mean by offshore outsourcing. So I want to clarify our thinking here. I mean labor arbitrage. What does that mean? It means the transfer of labor to cheaper regions enabled by information technology and communications. So let's state it again. When you're offshore outsourcing, there's no doubt about it. You're playing the game. Your company is playing the game of labor arbitrage. There's nothing wrong with that. Well, some people may think so. But you need to be alert to the reality of that. You need to be alert, too, to the reality that it's also a transfer of skills from one organization, the sponsor, to another organization, the provider. So you can begin to appreciate the nuance of the consequences, meaning if you don't know what your core competencies are, as I spoke about a moment ago, then you're going to end up giving them away. And by the way, that's real too. The history of commerce is littered with the casualties of this. You have to look no further than steel, automotives, TVs, chip manufacturers. We are today, as outsourcers, creating and at the same time participating in one of the great modern flows of skills and currency from the industrialized north to the developing south, India, China, Taiwan, as well as Eastern Europe. So the Industrial Revolution, you have to go back a way in history to find the previous immense wave in history that's comparable to ours. And that presaged the greatest flow of capital, goods, and labor the world had ever seen to that point, mostly from the old world to the new, or my birth country, England, to the USA. By comparison, today's outsourcing trends are vastly more regulated. Borders, trade agreements, data privacy laws, visas, government regulatory agencies, etc. So why does this all matter to you or to CROs in this audience today? Because simply put, decisions your company makes tomorrow about whom to partner with, where in the world to outsource, for how long and at what cost, all of this is at risk of being turned upside down. And when you are just transferring, not just transferring budget, but also skills, you need to be doubly alert to the decision and its consequences. And with a little forethought planning, most negatives can be ameliorated, as my case study later will show. So this is the summary. We're looking at the key forces I've identified that are driving global outsourcing trends. I'm going to read through the list quickly, and then the next few slides I'll tell you why you should be worried about each of these. So first is increased constraints in labor flow. What do I mean by increased from when? Well, in the last 100 years, and in the last couple of months, there's been major changes in political reaction to labor flow, and I'll talk a little about that. Reduced constraints on the movement of capital goods. So essentially what's happened with reduced banking regulation is the global flow of electronic funds is almost completely unregulated. By contrast, the global flow of labor is considerably more regulated, and they're two parts of exactly the same equation. So it's kind of interesting what's going on politically. And also, obviously, the increased ease and decreased costs of transportation don't really apply to what we're talking about. But the next one does, radically decreasing communication costs, increased technology, both very relevant, and I'll speak about those in the next two slides. Also, I mentioned the increased educational investment and social incentives in the developing South for technical and scientific capability versus the developed North. So yesterday on the BBC News, which I listen to every morning at 9 o'clock on my local public radio station here in Boston, I heard a very interesting statistic. A report was recently done and of the educational excellence of 15-year-olds throughout the world. I think the UN or one major regulatory body did the report. Anyway, the net result of it is in the top 10, there's only one Western country, and that turns out to be Finland, who ranks high in engineering, statistics, or mathematical skills, and all the rest go to these, what we're calling developing countries. Last but not least, wage convergence. That's probably something that's on all of your minds, and I'm not going to say what you expect me to say about that, but we'll come to that in a short while. Wage convergence simply means when the Indians get paid more than we get paid here in the US. That hasn't happened yet. Okay, so let's talk about let's talk about these labor flows. The latest U.S. immigration reform proposals have actually sent shockwaves through the outsourcing industry. Why? Because the proposals are to severely cap one of the visa types that are critical to running our business. Why? Because it's important that the countries with whom we can outsource, we can do these labor exchanges. We can do the rotation that Novartis talked about and that CyTel does routinely. It's also important for you as sponsor companies to have someone from your outsourcing partner who understands the culture, speaks the language, and can ease some of the issues we talked about with setting up some of the offshore outsourcing. The proposals that have been put in place require something called a high-skilled jobs demand index, and that drives the visa caps. My question is, who controls the HSJDI? Who controls what this high-skilled jobs demand index is? Well, it's the politicians. The deal with the reform proposals is you can't adjust the H-1B cap, which is the most critical visa to make the whole offshore outsourcing model work, by more than 10,000 each year, even if the economy expands and unemployment decreases much faster. And already these visas, they run out in like the first 2 months of the year. What if skill demand changes faster than this index? And what about critical lower skilled jobs? Anyway, the broad economics of that simply don't map well onto the specific occupational categories, and the politics don't map well onto the business demands. So let's, specifically, by the way, earlier this year, the U.S. company Cognizant, which has got a large offshoring business in India, CEO of that, just said this bill is going to negatively affect many of the largest companies in the U.S. who rely on these offshore services because of a shortage of scientific, technological, and engineering and math graduates. The U.S. and Western Europe is not going to fill that hole quickly. So some of that hole, I spoke about it earlier, go for specialized skills that you don't have internally. Some of that hole just cannot be filled quickly. So let's move on. So it means we've got less restricted flow of capital, mostly out of the industrialized north, without a balancing free flow of labor. I don't know enough about economics to predict the consequence of that, but obviously one of them is a significant change in the balance of power and significant short-term and potential long-term effects on U.S. companies. The decreasing communication costs, which act to reduce geographic concentration of industrial development, lower the cost to spread ideas and practice, which in turn result in improved coordination efficiency of doing things across countries and improve our outsourcing models, act with the increased availability of technologies to allow more tasks to be offshore. And the benefits to both parties are so compelling and so urgent that outsourcing is changing systematically where knowledge work is done. Work such as statistical programming, which has sustained a multi-billion-dollar industry in the US and Western Europe. As Stephen Roach says, the chief economist with Morgan Stanley, the internet has forever changed the competitive climate for most white-collar knowledge workers. Courtesy of near ubiquitous connectivity, the output of the knowledge worker can now be emailed to a desktop anywhere in the world. That brings low-cost, well-trained, highly educated workers in Bangalore, Shanghai, Eastern and Central Europe into the global knowledge worker pool. So for those politicians that say we're stealing jobs, let me say very clearly, these are not our jobs. These jobs are the cat's already out of the bag. Couple that to the increased educational investment and social incentives in the developing South and the technical and scientific capability versus the developed North, and you have a really interesting package that we're talking about today. So last but not least, on my list of big trends that you need to watch is this idea of wage convergence. So I've actually used this to my benefit when talking with procurement guys, but the fact of the matter is that it's not what it appears to be. So this is basically when offshore wages equal domestic wages, everyone in the developing South is worried about this, but it's a little more subtle. So what this curve shows is the Lewis turning point, and what that simply is, when surplus labor evaporates in those countries we're showing to, pushes up wages, consumption, and inflation, and the point marks where competitive and the pace of growth begins to turn down, labor costs rise. It's a way off. Actually, it's a long way off, both in India and China. And anyway, the short-term tactical challenges are still there, we spoke about, and it's a demonstrable fact that simplistic ROI calculations don't reflect the realities of startup costs, crossing the chasm, these complex issues of labor rates and labor inflation rates, or the true managerial overhead. So as one questioner asked me the last time I gave this presentation, what happens when your procurement asks you for more than you can get? The answer is to show them this presentation and explain that ROI simply doesn't take into account quality, effective relationships, or the willingness to go to work at 3 a.m. to meet a deadline. Experience in a clinical development team, all of these uncertainties, it may begin to look that it's surprising to you anyone ever outsources anything globally, but we need to recall the benefits: lower cost, more flexibility, focus on core competencies, process improvement. So outsourcing obviously can and does work in many situations, and for the last few slides, I'm going to present one of those situations. So this is a contract, a current contract that Cytel and Merck Serono have, where it represents getting most of the controls set right up front, adjusting those that need it, and getting the best people on the team doing it well. So this project is delivered and managed exclusively from Cytel's India office in Pune. Serono wanted this. They wanted the cost savings. They did not want to compromise quality and flexibility, and they didn't want to give up on delivery timeframes. They met with acheive, who runs our Indian operation, had a great deal of confidence in his ability and his team's ability to deliver all the project management and all the skills needed. So, and Serono was seeking, at the point we were speaking to them, when the contract began, which I think was 3 years ago now, they were seeking a way to increase their biostats capacity and flexibility to meet fluctuations in the workload. Cytel's core competency is biostats and data. So clearly we were one of the companies they looked at. Our success here depended on setting up realistic expectations from the beginning, gained from the experience that I mentioned to you before in our early contracts, recognizing and managing those startup costs, providing specialized skills, and making certain our outsourced operation, which, as I mentioned, was offshore in Pune, India, had appropriately experienced team of people and a bench of additional capacity. Interestingly, this is a very interesting point. It goes back to the education and the communication. To do this, acheive, who I mentioned is my colleague who runs Cytel India, literally started a new company. He started a training company, which we call ClipLab. It's wholly owned by Cytel. But that training company is to take well-educated, ambitious Indian statisticians and programmers and provide the vocational training necessary to enter the workforce as productive statistical programmers. So we began a company, and that is an independent, successful company for Cytel. And interestingly enough, companies like Cognizant, Novartis, and SAS send people to be trained to Cytel, to our company ClipLab. So we take anyone that's looking for this kind of vocational training. What this does is take really terrific educational background that a lot of the Indian schools offer and provide the vocational training needed. So Cytel maintains and develops that pool of people needed to feed our outsourcing business by providing this training and excellent work environment, as I said, specialized vocational training, ClipLab, all of which contribute to lower our average turnover. So as Michael Ball from Novartis said when he addressed Fuse, it's easy to hire someone. The hard thing is retaining them and making them productive. And the very two things are absolutely essential. To make someone productive in an offshore outsourced, a globally outsourced environment, you have to retain them. You have to retain them because by the time they've taken that 3 years, they've done the vocational training, they've done some months of work in the US or Western Europe, they are much more valuable than they were a year before when they began or 2 years before. So we're using an approach which combines resource balancing with specialized statistical expertise. We try to run all our projects with more qualified staff than our competitors, and I've already mentioned one of the several reasons we can do this, the most important being this independent training group, which we run. It's both a recruiting and a retention tool for Cytel and a way to secure higher than average success, more productivity, more experience, less rework, and actually, in addition to that, pick the cream of the crop. So the top guys in that training course, we try and hire in Cytel. So it lowers our turnover, improves productivity, and allows us to invest in our employees more. So the quality problem, which I've mentioned, which is a constant companion of outsourcing, is dealt with at the outset. A flow of well-trained staff from Pune University Statistics Department running through CLIP Lab, Cytel's vocational training program provides that flow. Extended exchange visits requiring those H-1B visas accomplishes some of what's missing in India, which is experience within an ecosystem of biopharma companies here in Boston. Next big problem was to avoid startup disruption. So let's look at that. How do we avoid startup disruption? Here are 2 pages from the index of a similar agreement which Cytel has in place. This indicate the thoroughness of the documentation which is needed to completely specify the performance criteria from the start. This is essential to a long-term strategic outsourcing partnership which is going to be successful. So just looking at some of these headers indicates the level of detail we've gone into with this particular partner. And by the way, this represents a contract which is many millions of dollars, and it's a 5-year commitment from both parties. So from the outset, we both anticipated, both partners, this wasn't Cytel's push, it was also our partner's pull, both partners recognized that what we establish in the next 1 to 3 years is going to be critical for producing the productivity, the workload flexibility, and the skills that our partner needs going forward. So this is one side that gives.
Steve, could I quickly just interject with a point of view?
Sure, Darren. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you make a really good point just by showing a glimpse at a table of contents of a representative contract, and it reminds me that these deals can be complex. Unnecessary complexity is not a good thing, but thorough and deep, which absolutely is. And I've been in the position to structure and negotiate dozens of similar deals, outsourcing deals that have been multi-year and high consideration deals. And one of the things that I always found to be a little bit troubling is that at the outset, the currency of an outsourcing decision and even the early stage negotiations comes down to dollars per hour. It's an easy shorthand way of comparing different providers, perhaps. And again, as you pointed out earlier in your discussion, the economics and desire for cost control and even an ROI model certainly suggest that. But in my experience, the dollars per hour, in the end, have very little to do with the success of the outcome, and the devil is always in the details. And while clients, for obvious reasons, want to optimize the dollar per hour figure, which is the driver of the cost of the contract, it's absolutely imperative, I think, to get to the depth of the terms early in the negotiation of an agreement, and even in the selection of the right partner, because some of the things that are referenced here just in this slide speak more to what will govern the way a relationship works successfully or not, to the degree to which it anticipates things that might go wrong, that it anticipates certain contingencies, and making sure that there's clarity and definition up front of how those will be handled by both parties, going both ways. And it's certainly been my experience that when these things are brought into the discussion early, it always yields a better outcome, and it's always a little dangerous when the papering of the contract, so to speak, is left as an afterthought or down the road and then sort of handed over to a legal department without proper agreement and definition of the business terms that will drive that. I think that's just, in my experience, that's been an absolutely critical element to making outsourcing relationships work well.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Darren. I think the currency of agreements often is the labor rate, the dollars per hour. And as you said, the ultimate performance of the contract is based on much deeper considerations than the labor rate. We negotiated a service deal this summer that I want to mention with a major pharmaceutical company by reverse auction. For those that don't know what a reverse auction is, it's when instead of the buyer bidding the price, as in a normal auction, the seller bids. So instead of the price going up, the price goes down. That's why it's called a reverse auction. It was the most pointless exercise and waste of resources I've ever been involved in. It assumed from the outset that you can compare side-by-side columns of 6 vendors, all of whom, by the way, had different knowledge, different experience, and understood what the work was in play to a very different degree. It was clinical study reports, safety memos, PK/PD memos, and so forth. They were quite complex. So, yeah, we were forced to do it. And interestingly enough, and this is a kind of curious fact of life, right? We won the deal. We weren't the lowest priced vendor. So in the end, I was encouraged by the fact that although we were forced to go through this rigmarole of a reverse auction, in the end, the client put together a decision list which had other criteria in it. But in outsourcing statistical programming work, intellectual work performed by highly trained specialists, I've found that never mind the obvious barriers, that we've talked about, like regulations, visas, reliability of infrastructure, and cost, there are more numerous soft barriers which can trip up even a well-planned project. So avoiding the startup disruptions are critical, dealing with the key performance indicators, customer satisfaction, and escalation procedures. Equally important for us in this Serono relationship were governance, which means establishing the orders, change control, what organizations are going to have oversight, what they're going to have oversight on, and making that apparatus flexible so it doesn't interfere with day-to-day decisions at the ground, but at the same time making it have high-level accountability to senior managers in both companies so that when something does need to be done, it can be done, and it can be done quickly. So that involves, standard operating procedures and all that, requests for change, changes in cost, and all this kind of stuff, right through to intellectual property agreements. What happens if someone invents something if the outsourced provider invents something during the course of the relationship? Who gets it? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, a reverse auction is based on the assumption that the participants are commodities, essentially, that they are parity, absolute parity, and interchangeable. And I think the overriding point is service relationships are anything but interchangeable and parity, because there's just so much depth and nuance into how the work gets done. And I think that's a very dangerous way to approach it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm just about to finish, and I think the truth is between Serono and Cytel is a good degree of cooperation at all levels and a great relationship, and it certainly isn't a commodity relationship. I think the idea of commodity and relationship are exactly the reverse. So Cytel operates as an extension arm of Serono using their own internal protocols, their own IT, their own infrastructure and SOPs. And because of the lower cost, Cytel can afford under the contract to maintain a bench of people for a more flexible and scalable result for Serono. And as my colleague DIA-Cytel says excellently well, this project is a great example of setting expectations realistically, managing the delivery carefully, with the result that cost savings are a natural consequence of the decision, providing cost savings without compromising the quality and flexibility Serono needs. So for all that, outsourcing is going to continue to shape our world. And with that, I'm going to summarize what we've said and take a few questions. So we talked about the offshoring outsourcing model, bringing those three big benefits: savings, labor flexibility, and specialized skills. We talked about the do's and the don'ts, and we said very clearly, don't outsource for cost benefits alone. It takes time to get these relationships working. It takes time to get the operations working. Don't get caught up in ROI calculations. They will not tell you the whole truth, or labor rates. And lastly, using a common sense approach to balancing outsourcing and offshoring that works for your specific situation. So with that, I'm going to end by acknowledging the careful quantitative work being done by two organizations whose material I've used here, Tufts Center for Drug Development here in Boston and the Avoca Consortium, both of whom stand as beacons to illuminate the realities all too often invisible in the scuffle for survival and lower prices. I'd also like to thank EMD Serono for providing the case materials and recognize the Cytel co-founder, Professor Cyrus Mehta, for the vision to get all this rolling, and to Jim Baker, DIA-Cytel, and ClipLab for helping make Cytel's offshore outsourcing performance possible. Thank you.
And this is Mike Weitz again, and I want to thank everyone for being online, and I hope you'll stay with us because Steve's going to address some of the questions that were submitted by yourselves. So let's get right into them, not wasting any time. Also, before that, I do want to thank Darren Abrams for being online and his contributions, absolutely. Steve, Matt Stevens asks I consider a know thyself question. What can the sponsor company do better to assess and document their own competencies, and which areas they're specifically, where do they need help? Oftentimes the sponsor companies can take it for granted that they know what they know.
Yeah. That's a really terrific question and incredibly difficult to answer in a few sentences. I will say that for Cytel, it's really clear for us what we're good at. We're good at biostats. We understand the flow of data. We understand the analytics. We do a lot of trial design. So for us, it's pretty clear we're not going to take an outsourcing for CRAs or clinical monitoring. We're simply not going to do that. And also for us, it's very clear that we are well-known and very competent in adaptive designs, group sequential designs, more complex designs. So again, when we see bids for contracts like that, it's going to be clear. So small companies in general, I'm not trying to say small companies are best in all cases, but simply to say that most frequently we know and stick to our core skills. We simply don't have the resources to take on contracts that we can't do well at, and that would stretch our core competencies. I really can't speak to the bigger companies. I think many of them have extensive and really terrific skills, but you need to look very carefully at the team that you're going to be getting. So it's pretty general advice, and I think that's the best I can do at answering that question.
And Steve, Ryan Kelly, Ryan asks about confidentiality agreements and the constraints that they pose. Oftentimes, it's difficult to assess a prospective partner's degree of quality or their performance. Again, in trying to get referrals from other colleagues and companies, confidentiality agreements get in the way. And any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's interesting. I see probably 90% of the contracts that come through Cytel, both software and services contracts, and I sign, of those contracts that flow through here, I'm daily signing multiple confidentiality agreements. I think most of them are not worth the paper they're printed on, but they're necessary backups for us. So to be truthful, most violations of confidentiality happen when they happen, and it's very rare, and not happening to steal something from one company to another. I would say my experience is they should not get in the way of sharing sufficient information to be able to pick a partner. I, for instance, I probably wouldn't recommend signing general confidentiality agreements at the point that you're trying to choose a partner. At the point that you're sharing a protocol, you're clearly going to do that. Your lawyers and your management, your VCs are going to require that at that point you sign that confidentiality agreement. By the way, it doesn't have to be two-way. Cytel prefers them to be two-way because it has its own intellectual property on adaptive designs and small sample statistics and so on. But they don't have to be. So one answer to that question was insist on a one-way confidentiality agreement which protects your interests and does not insist that the partner to be has, can't disclose to you other information. But I will say that most confidentiality agreements that CROs and service providers enter into prevent them from even disclosing the existence of an agreement. Certainly always, in my experience, and this has changed radically over the last decade, always prevents you naming the company unless, as we've done with Serono, you get explicit permission to do so. So I agree confidentiality clauses can get in the way. And as I said, I think the best weapon you have on your side would be to get a one-way confidentiality which protects the sponsor and doesn't necessarily grant that same immunity to your partner or to partner to be.
And Steve, Shilpa Govindra, she asks, can you provide any specific examples of how cultural issues can be successfully addressed in an offshoring relationship? I know I've heard our management team speak often that recognizing typical East-West cultural communication differences is very important.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question, Shilpa. I actually expected a question like that, and I called a colleague of ours yesterday, Vaibhav, in our Pune office, in our Chesterbrook office, who is recently moved over from India and does a lot of those communications. And I asked him, what issues do we have in Cytel? His first answer is, we don't have any. I'm not sure that's true. But what I am sure is, what he means is, I manage them well, Steve. What he means is, I can be the go-between and deal with cultural issues. But I think there's a couple of things which help him. Number one is, we put every employee through training which tests them and requires them to ask questions. So they're not afraid of asking questions to their boss. And they understand clearly their job won't be on the line, their credibility won't be on their line, and their bosses understand that too and go through the same training. Secondly, we do this rotation where we have our India staff rotate and come to Boston, Pennsylvania, or our office in Geneva to work, often for several months at a time, and we've had people that have come for a year or longer at a time. That does two things. It helps the staff that come over, and it helps them train the staff that don't come over. So I think that's probably the best advice I can give there. The cultural issues are definitely there. A short and silly story, when we were dealing with the Wyeth agreement, our manager on site really could not understand the difference between water cooler conversation and instructions that came in a conference, you know, around a table where people were talking about the protocol. And that definitely provided challenges very early on for Cytel. So I do understand they exist, and I think the answer is cultural education, both sides.
And Steve, we just got a question in from Kim Smith, and Kim's asking about you know, the hidden costs involved when the the quality of the work isn't up to the standards, and the costs there. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about how best to get agreement ahead of time so that they're measurable.
Yeah, that's a really terrific question, a great way of expressing it. Because the first thing I was going to say is, first thing to avoid hidden costs is make sure they're not hidden. And once they're not hidden, you know how to assign them. And I would say if there's rework, I mean, clearly, I mean, that's a cost which comes up very frequently in these kind of contractual relationships. You need to look at it very, very carefully. And your sponsor should be a good enough partner that they're going to deal with that, unless it's a huge amount of work that obviously was not conceived at the beginning, in which case they're going to be asking for a change order. In one of the three case studies I gave, which has been now renewed 3 times, so it's now been it's in its 7th year of contract. We do all the rework without cost, and I'll tell you how we do that. We do exactly what Darren suggested was, or implied was, good practice, which is we didn't negotiate labor rates and we didn't disclose our labor rates. We negotiated unit costs for the work. And guess what happens there? We get paid a little more if we do it right first time, and we get paid less if we screw up and we have to rework. So one way of avoiding those hidden costs is to not encourage change orders. So this is one of the big things that puzzles me about the CRO business. It survives, the margins on the business survive on change orders. And change orders are exactly what the clients don't want. I mean, there are cases, right, many cases where the trial changes, timelines change, and you're going to have a change order. But there's equally many times where just there's a little contractual change, and it's not appropriate to be doing change orders. I think at that point, that uncovers the sin of costing by labor dollars. I think we should much more be looking at results and negotiating on unit costs based on what the deliverables are, whether it's a safety memo, a CSR, certain number of tables, listings, and figures. Let's deal with the unit cost instead of the labor costs. That's much harder to have the budget creep issue when there are unexpected or hidden costs or rework.
And Steve, earlier David Brown asked, maybe he was a little scared by the first step of the presentation, with all the issues involved with offshoring, why bother at all? Why not stay domestically, regionally?
Isn't that a good question? And since Cytel both has onshore and offshore resources, it's a question which we ask really, really frequently. And I think the answer to that is pretty much in my presentation. You don't have to stick slavishly to this, but here's a good rule of thumb. If the contract's going to be one project and in and out in the space of a year, and you've got no pre-existing relationship with the CRO, then do it onshore, because that's a project where there's going to be a lot of communication, where you can avoid some of the startup costs, and where you can avoid some misunderstandings that might occur with these hidden costs or rework that the previous questioner answered about, and where the question before that, where the cultural issues simply won't play a part. Do it onshore. If it's going to be a multi-year relationship, multi-projects, and you're setting something up to run for a considerable period of time, and you want the benefit of considerable savings, do it offshore. So I think balancing those is never going to be easy, but that would be my 2 cents worth on that. Excellent question, David. Thank you.
And Steve, we just got a question in from Emily Bachman, I think you can see here, that talks about some of the longer scale commitments and bigger projects. In your experience, advice on contract model, FTE, then deliverable unit, once benchmarks are established?
Okay, good question. I'm going to try and plumb the depths of the several contracts that we've got going now. CyTel's a small company. We have, half a dozen of big contracts going. The majority of our work actually is onshore, done in either Western Europe, our Geneva office, or in the U.S. Of those contracts we've got, which are multi-year commitments and bigger headcounts, and where there's a significant offshore component. Okay, I think a dedicated team is always going to be better if you can get them commitments to dedicate them for a period of time. That's not always easy to get, but it's easier to get when you negotiate a longer agreement. It's always going to be better if you can do that. On the other hand, you've got to balance the obvious labor mobility and the desire for people both in India and in the US to develop their careers against a sponsor's desire for a dedicated team. So there have to be clauses to manage flux, to manage people coming in and out. Generally, the way our contracts have done that is to name key people and also to have a process for moving someone off the project and onto the project. Sometimes literally our clients have to approve any hires we make or any people we bring onto the project. They have to get physically interviewed by the client. In other cases, the clients trust us to do that, and there's just a process in place. In terms of headcount and size, first of all, I do think for a strategic partner, a 3-year plus commitment, as you mentioned in this, is important, Emily. And then as far as the size goes, I think you can run it from very small to tens of millions of dollars. For a small company like CyTel, if it's going to be a huge contract for any small company, you're going to have to allow ramp-up times and work with that. And to be honest with you, that doesn't just apply to small companies. Bigger companies like Accenture and Cognizant have exactly the same problems of hiring and ramp-up that small companies like CyTel have. It's identical. They will need ramp-up time, and they probably have even tougher times recruiting than a small company like CyTel does, because for us, we've got to focus biostats, data management. There is a career path. There's a software as well as a services unit. Sometimes the bigger companies can't easily offer that. And then as far as FTEs versus deliverables, I've already stated my preference for deliverables over FTEs. I think that's the way we should go. I think negotiating, and I think Darren said this too, negotiating FTEs ends up negotiating annual or hourly rates, and I think that can be counterproductive. On the other hand, I think you need a part of every contract which anticipates unexpected work. And for that, frankly, if I was a sponsor, I would want to have locked-in rates, and maybe there's a rate inflation too. But you'd certainly want to have a sense of what you're in for in the future if there's rework or deliverables that you don't anticipate that you want to give to your outsourced partner.
All right, Steve, I think that's all we have time for today, and I really wanted to thank our online audience and the excellent questions that they posed. And as a reminder, once again, you can download Steve's slides today directly from the homepage at cytel.com. Just go to cytel.com and you'll see the link prominently displayed. Also, everyone will receive a notice of when the replay of this webinar will be available, and you'll get that information from the folks at the DIA. I'm going to say goodbye from Steve and I, and again, thank you for joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I give you back to Ben Zaitz and the DIA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you, Steve and Darren, for your participation today. Just wanted to let everyone know that we hoped you enjoyed this online educational experience, and please be sure to visit the DIA website to view a complete listing of all of our educational offerings, as well as to register for upcoming webinars. Please take the time to evaluate this webinar by completing our online survey. Again, you will be directed to that online survey immediately following today's webinar. DIA is committed to developing quality education programs that meet the needs of its members, and your feedback is greatly appreciated. appreciated. The results of our surveys are used to plan future programs. Thank you again to Cytel, our speakers, and also to you for joining today's webinar. As Mike mentioned, we will be sharing the recording, the actual slides, and the audio for this webinar. As soon as it is checked for quality, we'll be getting that out to all the attendees in the next couple of days. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.